So, at the risk of sounding like an old-fashioned preacher, let me begin this afternoon with this text. The decline of newspapers, I think it's there, is paralleled by a decline in the numbers of journalists, while the rise in social media is paralleled by a rise in the dissemination of fake news. Now, if I was preaching, I'd repeat that in very sonorous terms. By a rise in the dissemination of, and so on. But I'll spare you that because it's there on the screen for you to contemplate as I talk. Now, I need to say, first of all, that I regard myself rather grandly as a digital revolutionary or a digital missionary. I was an early adopter, as we say, and I have a great deal of time for the digital tools that we now use. I don't blame, like some people, digital technology for what happens. It didn't create the darkest force that is threatening Ireland today. That's Brexit. The people using technology or misusing it, human beings, they are to blame one way or another for what happens with digital technology. The technology, has provided us with both advantages and disadvantages. And I'll argue that the disadvantages do present an existential threat to journalism. And in so doing, I'll therefore echo the title of this session by saying that they therefore threaten democracy. So consider first the advantages. The ease of discovering information, the swift imparting of that information to audiences, the instant transmission of news, and the almost simultaneous analysis of that same news, followed by a rapid deconstruction of that analysis through forums where journalists and audiences interact, supposedly. We talk to people, and they talk back to us. In fact, the truth is, of course, they shout back at us. Now, when traditional media organizations launched their websites around the end of the last millennium, I can recall how uncomfortable that was for veteran journalists. We had been the unchallenged gatekeepers to the news and analysts of the same news. So it was a life-changing experience, and plenty of ink on dead wood journalists didn't like it. By contrast, the incoming generation certainly did. They could see the benefits. But these advantages for newspaper-based journalism have been counterbalanced by the economic reality of a competitive media platform. It soon became obvious that the two major only forms of revenue for newspapers, the money paid by advertisers and the money that people paid across the counter for their papers, were under threat. But despite the gravest of warnings from digital missionaries who could visualize the future, it took a long time for everyone involved in newspapers, whether they be owners, whether they be editors or other journalists, to realize what was termed by digital disruption, because that really meant, in our industry, trade, digital destruction. Quite simply, the business model which has sustained the production of newspapers in the UK since 1855 was in ruins, over, gone, kaput, gone forever. Running in parallel has been the disappearance of the newsprint audience. They've turned their backs on print in favor of reading online, most obviously on tablets and smartphones. And here's the result. This is what's happened to national papers across the UK. Traditionally, the biggest newspaper market in Europe, down by 54% over the course of 17 years. And because I did those last year, I can tell you the latest ones are worse still. But of course you're wondering what's happened in Ireland. Worse, far worse. Same story of decline in the main daily titles in both the Republic and the 6 counties. Newsprint, it appears, is so last century. Of course, all these newspapers have websites which are attracting many, many thousands of clicks every day. But the problem, despite the increasing number of people who do access those newspapers online, only a small amount comes in by advertising revenue, and except in those rare cases where people pay for access, a very small amount comes in terms of what we used to call circulation revenue. Profit margins have therefore dwindled. And as the effects of falling revenue hit home, owners and publishers have responded by cutting costs, letting people go in human terms. In the early days, it was fashionable to call that pruning. But any of you who are gardeners will know the point of pruning is to cut away the dead wood to encourage growth. And the one thing we haven't had in its place is genuine growth. Growth certainly of some digital skills, I think, but no nurturing and regrowth of journalism. And that, I'm afraid, is a moot point that exists between journalists on one side and publishers and managers on the other. The shockwave that is social media has transformed the gradual drip loss of advertisers and readers into a flood. And the result has been the devastation of traditional media companies across the developed world, the UK, USA, Europe, and here. Newspapers have been closed, dailies have become weeklies, titles have been merged, and all the time, editorial staffs have been cut and cut and cut. Many thousands of journalists have been made redundant in the United States, part of which, to quote an American media commentator, has become a news desert in the States. In Britain, the number of journalists has been falling year by year and is now 50% fewer than a decade ago. Now you might ask, why is this a problem? So let me start to answer that with this terrible story that you all know about, the Grenfell tragedy, the Grenfell Tower tragedy in London. That fire at that 24-story block of flats in June last year. 72 people killed, 70 injured, everyone put out of a home. At one time, as recently as 1990, the area surrounding Grenfell was covered by 10 reporters employed by a paper called the Kensington and Chelsea Chronicle. A free title, admittedly, but owned by the UK's biggest and most profitable regional media company, then known as Trinity Mirror. It was closed in 2014 and replaced by the Kensington and Chelsea News, which was staffed by one reporter located in Dorset. For those of you who don't know, that's 150 miles away from London, who only went to Kensington twice in 2 years. No reporter was dedicated to the task of representing the views of citizens, most importantly, not also attending council meetings and therefore holding local politicians to account. So there were no journalists around in November 2016, when that tragedy happened, to pick up on this most amazingly accurate prediction of what would occur 7 months later. I apologize. It was a slide that obviously failed to do. It said, only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, and bring to an end the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety legislation they inflict upon their tenants. This was written before that tragedy occurred. Written by a man called Edward Daffern, a social worker living on the 16th floor of the tower, who's since been dubbed, unsurprisingly, the prophet of Grenfell. Now, it wasn't an isolated example. He and the action group, which he was a member of, had been campaigning for years to try and improve the conditions of the tower block. But their campaign went unheard unrecognized because it was not publicized. That kind of campaign was meat and drink to the kind of local paper I worked on in East London in my youth. It was what local newspapers existed for, to hold local power to account, to make sure that councillors were not ignoring their residents. A former reporter on that defunct paper I mentioned, the Kensington and Chelsea News, agreed. He told the trade magazine that covers our business that in his days, when his paper existed, without a doubt, we would have come across that blog. Nor, indeed, would they have even come across it online by random, because they would have been part of the community and known that there were problems in that area. After Grenfell, Peter Preston, the late, great editor of The Guardian, who died earlier this year, sadly, he put the absence of the newspaper's editorial staff in perspective when he wrote, "Without journalists to raise a ruckus, scandal slides by unchecked." And that's my view too. And it's also the view of an American editor. This is an amazing coincidence that I was speaking here today. An American editor, New York Daily News, who was fired on Monday this week, along with 50% of his staff. 50%. On Monday he tweeted, and that's what I do have, "If you hate democracy and think local government should operate unchecked and in the dark, then today is a good day for you." They were let go because of cuts. And he changed that Twitter handle, note it there, just a guy now sitting at home watching journalism being choked into extinction. My view too. However, as many of you may be thinking, why should old-fashioned newspapers be so important in the digital age? At national level, they run big websites. At local level, they're being supplemented or replaced by hyperlocal startups. So let's take that individually. The UK national newspaper websites appear only to be prospering because they rack up large numbers. But the underlying story behind that is not at all so heartening. In several cases, they're just repurposing material that appears in print, and they are suffering from an absence of staff. And from hiring, it should be said, largely, and many of them are my ex-students, so I don't do them down, but people who can be obtained relatively cheaply while allowing the experienced journalists to be given redundancy. Local paper websites are facing exactly the same problem. One of the big beasts of the jungle here, stealing our readers, stealing our advertising, is Facebook. Now, it's the perfect kind of newspaper for people. It's like a me newspaper. Gives you intimate news about your family and friends and relatives. And as for national and international news or affairs, it learns what you like and then gives it back to you, creating the phenomenon we know as the filter bubble. What it doesn't do is open your eyes to a wider world. Therefore, the unknown unknowns, quite literally, remain unknown. And as we witnessed during the US presidential election, information which is often accessed online turns out to be fake news, masquerading as truth. And those of us who monitor these things can see how often the falsehood catches on before it can be exposed and countered. The lie takes hold before the denial ever gets a grip. Now, I need to just remind you of that Grenfell example to underline why I view the demise of newspapers as threatening to our democracy. Now, you'll be saying, I'm sure, hey, just a minute, Roy, these newspapers don't have a great track record. We know that they're not so good either. I know that too. For 25 years on The Guardian, I've been a critic of my own trade. And I know there's been poor content. There's been that hacking scandal. There has been journalists who've gone to jail, in most cases, by the way, quite rightly. And a judge-led inquiry discovered all sorts of things that we were up to. But I think, if you go back to that quote for a second, you can see that does contain the fallacy. And the fallacy is that it implies that fake news is only generated by social media, while we know that newspapers have been as guilty as anyone else. But misrepresentation, yes, and bigotry and omission, and tabloids are played to the gallery rather than confront readers with the home truth, and so on. Talk about dark forces. But I realize, and this is a hell of a big but, a B-U-T, in spite of that, all this overlooks the good journalism that has run side by side with the bad. A random example, the Trafficura pollution problem scandal, the Windrush scandal, the Panama Papers scandal, the Westminster MP's expenses scandal, the death of Stephen Lawrence, itself a scandal, Cambridge Analytica, the running over time scandal. But you're all enjoying this, aren't you? Loads of scandals exposed. These have been marked by the fact that journalists provided with the necessary resources to carry them out. Big staffs, lots of experience, skilled people around them. And that is what we are gradually losing, and we're losing it because we need to find a new way to subsidize journalism. I'll finish on this point, honest. I've only got another 20 minutes to go. What we need to do is, if we say that private funding of journalism has failed and produced newspapers which are not doing the job of truth-telling, what we need to do is to say, we want public service journalism paid by the public. Now, we have the BBC in Britain, which has got a license fee. You have the RTE, which is half paid by license fee. There already exists a structure in which the public we could find a way of the public contributing. We ought to make space for philanthropy, which has happened only to a small extent in Britain. We can add on the advertising, if you like. But what we need to say is, if we are going to reinvigorate journalism for the good of citizens, for the good of the public, then the public have to be, you all have to put your hands in your pockets and be prepared to say, we think it worthwhile funding journalism, because without journalism, people are not informed enough to make the best choices at the ballot box. And if they don't do that, the great problem will be democracy. Now, I had much more to say. And if you want to meet me in the bar afterwards, I will say it. Thank you.